Hello everybody, welcome to my channel. My name is Evelyn of Pink Sheep Design, and today we are going to be reviewing a new yarn. I don't think it's a new yarn, but newer to me, and that is Hobbie's Baby Snuggle yarn. So when I first went to purchase Hobbii Baby Snuggle, looking at it on the website, I saw that it said it was a super bulky size 6. So I figured it would be a really great alternative for me to use for some of my patterns that call for like a blanket yarn. So let me grab really quick. Let's see. So this kind of Chanel style blanket yarn, I've used it in a couple of different patterns, and there are a lot of different companies that make it. So we've got Bernat blanket yarn. I know Joann's and Michael's have their own version as well at the craft stores. I believe Hobby Lobby has their own version of blanket yarn. So in my mind, that is kind of where my thought process was with this yarn, seeing that it was a size 6. So first impressions, for me, it definitely felt thinner than a size 6. And I feel like this has been pretty normal with Hobbii yarn. So a lot of the Hobbii yarn that I've purchased that says it's a size 6, to me feels a little bit lighter. In some cases, even their size 5s will feel a lot more like a size 4. So this one definitely feels to me a bit more like a size 5 weight. This is what it looks like caked up. I have done a couple of projects with it. But we'll go through some of kind of the first impressions. So very, very, very soft yarn. So this is, it is very, very soft. It does not shed while I worked with it. So that was not a big issue. The issue was when I cut the ends, which tends to happen a lot with this kind of Chanel blanket yarn, this kind of fuzzier yarn. Whereas a lot of times this kind of blanket yarn, it doesn't have that slickness, and the fibers are attached in a way like you can see here. You can actually see the piece of yarn that the fibers are attached to. And so I think they kind of maybe run parallel to that through it. Whereas with this, the fibers are attached all the way around. So I think when you cut it, they tend to shed off a little more easily. This is a hat that I made using this yarn. I held it double stranded because, again, I felt like it was a little lighter than my preference for a 6 weight yarn. But this is held double using an 11 millimeter hook. So this is 11 millimeter hook, Hobbii Baby Snuggle held double. The issues came when I made a pom-pom using this yarn and tassels using this yarn. So anytime I get this hat down off the shelf and it shakes a little bit, I have little pieces that tend to just kind of fall off of it. Now, I still love this hat. It's again, super soft. When I held it double and used the 11 millimeter hook, it did have what felt to be a little bit of give to the yarn. This is not a stretchy yarn by any means. But again, using it held double, to me, the fit is really nice because it kind of wraps around my head in a nice way, you know? So I do like that. That was really nice for that. But let's go over what the label tells us. So this is 100% polyester, very similar to a lot of other Chanel yarn. You get 131 yards, which is pretty good for a bulkier yarn to get over 100 yards of that yarn. It does say that it calls for a 6 millimeter hook, which should have been my very first kind of red flag moment. If I'm looking at a super bulky size 6 yarn, most of those yarn options recommend an 8 millimeter or a 9 millimeter hook, even sometimes an 11 millimeter hook. So let's see, just for comparison, this Bernat style blanket yarn calls for a 10 millimeter hook versus a 6. And I know Lion brand Wool Ease Thick and Quick, which has always been my go-to recommendation for beginners working with super bulky yarn, that yarn calls for an 8 millimeter hook. So now I do have a handy dandy 6mm hook. So you can see that here. These are our 3D printed ergonomic hybrid hook handles that we use with both. We have both the tapered and the inline options on these. I'm going to be using a tapered style. That is definitely more, if I have to choose between tapered and inline for metal hooks like this that are not like a furls hook, this is what I will go with. So I am going to do a wraps per inch test really quick. So this is a great tool that kind of tells you, based on industry standards, how many wraps of yarn you should be able to get across 1 inch and what that standardized measurement should be. All right, so super bulky yarn is within a 5 to 6 wrap range for the inch. We do sell these in our Etsy shop if you need one. This is really great for mystery yarn. If you do a lot of thrifting or finding yarn at yard sales or Goodwill and that doesn't have tags, it's a great way to double check the weight of the yarn before you choose which project you are going to do with that yarn. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and take this label off of here and let's get to wrapping. All right, so I've got my wraps per inch tool. I'm going to go around the first piece here. And keeping in mind, you're not going to try to squish it in place, just try to wrap nice and soft. So we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So it is within the super bulky range. So this is 6 wraps here. And so technically it's not incorrect, obviously. It is just on the lighter side. So I know for me personally, when I'm working with a super bulky yarn, I tend to gravitate towards the yarns that are closer to 5 wraps per inch versus 6. Will you get down? We got a photo bomber, video bomber down here. All right, so got the wraps per inch done. So it is a super bulky weight yarn with 6 wraps per inch. But let's look at how it works up. All right, so I'm going to flip the camera around and let's see it. All right, so I did notice that this yarn, if you allow it to get jumbled up like this, it can kind of catch on itself and twist up really easily. So just be careful if you pull a lot of yarn out and kind of make a pile to get yourself ready to use it. That may not work as well with this yarn. It really works well if you just cake it. So if you have a yarn winder, if you can make a cake, that is going to be the easiest and cleanest way to use this yarn and work with it. All right, so let's make I was trying to figure out if I should stand up or sit down to film this. I guess you guys can't tell, so it doesn't matter. But like I said, I have my 6mm hook, and let's just do a chain 2, 3, whoop, 4, 6, ooh, 8, 9, 10. Now, I don't use smaller hooks very often, so it's definitely more of a challenge for me to get used to hooks like this. I usually use hooks that are more in this size range. So some of this is probably not the yarn. It's usually me trying to work with my smaller hooks to show them for these yarn reviews. But I do have to say this is a slick yarn. So I think that is some of it. So it'll kind of slip through my fingers. I hold my yarn, I wrap it around my pinky. And so I think sometimes if a yarn is slicker, and it is colder outside now, which means it's colder in my house. So my hands don't have any of that moisture to them that would kind of hold it in place. Don't mean like straight up sweaty hands, but you know, not dry, cold hands. All right, so the yarn is working up. It works up really well. I enjoyed using it. Like I said, I did not make something with it single-stranded. I only used it double-stranded. And like I said, that was to make this hat that you can see in the corner. But it has really nice stitch definition, even using double-stranded yarn. And this was, like I said, an 11mm hook, whereas this is a 6mm hook here. The 6mm hook does work. It doesn't feel like the yarn is too large for the hook, which can sometimes happen if you go too small on your hook size for a yarn that's too large. It can feel difficult to grip the yarn into the actual hook part of the hook. And the further I get along in a project and I have more to hang on to, it's usually easier for me to work with that yarn. So I've actually got some grip and some control over the piece. All right. So let's flip this. I'm going to do one more row and I'm going to do half double crochet. So let me see if I can come up a little bit closer for you. I do feel like chenille yarn, it can be a little more difficult to work with. So my advice when you're using chenille yarn is just take your time. Try a few different hooks if you have the ability to. You know, if you have some inline style hooks, if you have tapered hooks, wooden hooks, try a few different ones out, because it's definitely a different experience working with this kind of yarn versus just like an acrylic or a wool blend. It's going to feel different on your hook. So, you know, just playing around with different ones that you have may help you have the best experience possible when you're working with this type of yarn. All right. There we go. Alrighty. So that is 2 rows of single crochet, 1 row of half double, and you can see it's pretty small. I mean, again, I know the wraps per inch put this at a super bulky yarn, but I know for me, usually I can get away with using something like a 16mm hook with super bulky yarn, which I really don't see that happening with this yarn single-stranded. We're actually gonna to check that out real quick just to see what happens. Usually I will use something like this Wool Ease Thick and Quick. I actually have a cardigan called the Luna cardigan that calls for this specific yarn. It is also considered a size 6 super bulky, and you can use a 16mm hook to create the cardigan. So let's see what this would look like if we used a 16mm hook. So I'm just going to do a chain of 6. 4, 5, and a 6. So my issue is when the loops start to get that big, I struggle with tension until I can really get a couple rows into the project. But we are going to still try to work this across. Now, what I try to do is keep good tension on my yarn and slide it all the way down onto the base part of the hook where it's actually the true measurement of the hook. All right, so we've got 1, and now I can, it's hard to even tell. There we go. I think that's the next hole. Gets a little messy. Yeah, I definitely would not recommend, especially if you are a beginner, trying to use this yarn for any of my patterns that call for a hook larger than a 10mm. So you could probably get away with using this yarn for like my Dobby hoodie, my Dobby sweater, Dobby cardigan. That one calls for a 5-weight yarn and a 10mm hook. And although this is technically a true 6, it works very well with the 10mm hook versus a larger hook like a 15 or a 16. Now, once I've gone in a few rows, like you can see, it's definitely easier for me now that I've gotten a row in. I'm going to do half double crochet for the next row, but now I have something to hold on to, so it's going to make it a lot easier. So you could technically get away with this, but it's probably not going to be as great of an experience for you creating the project versus going with a smaller hook like a 10mm or smaller to use this. I mean, and it says it on the label. It recommends a 6mm. So jumping all the way up to something like a 16, you know, you should already know it probably won't be the most amazing experience. So You can see it's working up. I mean, it's definitely got quite a bit of loose stitch structure there. It would be doable, but like I said, I would definitely stick with an in-between. So like I said, this would be really great to use with like my Hobbii cardigan, which calls for a 5 weight, but it also just calls for a 10 millimeter hook. And I feel like this would work up really well with a 10 millimeter hook in that size range. Or if you really want the ultimate squish, this was an 11 millimeter hook, but I double stranded the yarn. So you can see I've got 2 strands held together for this. And used an 11 millimeter. You could get away with an 11.5. I think 11 millimeter is more difficult to find. We have them in our Etsy shop since we print our hooks, like these guys. But you can find a Susan Bates 11.5 millimeter. We actually sell them in our shop now, just to have them available as a more affordable introductory option. And you can see the fluff that's coming off of the pom-pom. That was... I don't recommend making pom-poms for these using this yarn. I would use like a faux fur yarn for this because not only do they shed like crazy, they don't fill the pom-pom out very much. Even if you use a lot of yarn, it's harder to get it to fill out. So yeah, but that is Hobbii Baby Snuggle. I really enjoyed using it. I would totally buy it again. They have a lot of color options. I would just plan to hold it double for any of my projects that I'm going to use my larger hooks on. So I'm going to treat it more like a size 5, more like a 5 weight yarn. But again, very soft. And here, actually, you can see the yarn structure. So you see these 2 kind of cord-like thread pieces. That is what is running down the center of this, holding all of the fluffies in place. So I hope you enjoyed this review. Let me know in the comments if you have used Baby Snuggle before, if you like this yarn, what your experience has been with it. I have all of the information in the description about the hooks I've used, the tools that I used, and where to find this yarn. And until next time, happy hooking!